We're so glad to see you all. We know that to give up your lunchtime on a Friday means that you really are wanting to learn something today. And so we've got a bunch of ideas that we've kind of brainstormed, some reminders about just kind of parent night in general, and then some specific food for thought for parent night in this reality that we're living in right now. I can't remember if there are any new teachers to GBS in the Zoom, but just in case they are, we met you guys during orientation, but my name is Marshall Harris. I'm one of the instructional coaches. I'm also a member of the English department, and co-presenting with me today is Sharon Sheehan. She's an instructional coach and a member of the math department, and we're your colleagues. That's our job, is to offer these kinds of lunch sessions, but more than that, to be your thinking partners if and when you ever want support for things you're doing in class. And that includes this. That includes parent night. So we're going to go through a bunch of stuff, a lot of ideas. We're going to move pretty quickly. The slide deck will be available to you. We're actually recording this session, so if you wanted to re-watch any of this later, you could do that. But then you can also reach out to not just me and Sharon, but Caitlin and Matt as well. If you want to brainstorm for parent night, if you want to test technology, if you want to bounce some ideas around, we're there for you, okay? What you'll see, though, is we're going to give way more ideas than you can possibly do in 10 minutes. 10 minutes with parents is very short. It's going to feel like the blink of an eye. And so what we're going to give you is lots of ideas that could possibly be used. And we're going to talk about general considerations as well. Okay, so with all that said, let's get started. First and foremost, we just want to remind you that you should be yourself. That might be stating the obvious, but it can feel like a pressure-filled 10 minutes where maybe you're like performing or putting up a certain image. And we just know from years of conversations with parents and with our colleagues about what goes well. That's the number one piece of advice that we would give, is just be comfortable being yourself. That's part of what parents want to learn, is who you are. Additionally, especially for the new-ish or new teachers in the room, we just want to make it really clear that we hope that you can let go of any anxiety you feel about having to like prove yourself, right? It's not a job interview. You don't have to list your resume. If you want to talk about your own educational and professional past, more power to you, but don't feel pressured to do that. And don't feel like anyone's going to be judging you based on it. You work at Glumberg South for a reason, and parents generally know that. You're a qualified professional. In terms of this all happening in the digital space, we do want to just remind you to be thoughtful about your digital appearance. And this might be stating the obvious, but we thought it was important enough that we should just remind you of it today. Think about limiting your background distractions, sights, and sounds as much as possible. Really consider using one of the virtual backgrounds that a lot of our colleagues have been using, either a classroom space or something content related that can eliminate the possibility that parents might have a problem with where you are or have judgments about what's in your background if you use a well-chosen virtual background. In terms of your attire, you should, of course, dress how you would for an in-person parent night. I never, ever wear a tie to school, but I do on parent night. And I'm not saying that men in the room that you have to do that, but just a thought about maybe even upping your attire game for parent night. And then in terms of the digital space, testing everything beforehand is going to be really, really crucial. And you'll hear us talk about this as well, but having a backup plan if you're going to be using technology in addition to Zoom would probably be a really good idea, just in case something fails you. You don't want to be left with nothing. So we also want to remind you that these are not conferences, and some parents either don't get that or don't care. and they will try to engage you in conversations about their individual child and how things are going. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. If parents want to have conversations at some point, especially given that we don't do conferences anymore, that's totally appropriate. It's just not the timing that's appropriate. But we wanted you to, especially if this is one of your first parent nights in the classroom, just to give you a heads up that some parents will try to turn it into that. And so on the next slide, we just wanted to offer some sentence stems, some ideas for how you might respond if and when parents try to do that. Asking them what would be a good time to call, saying, affirming that you want to hear more about it. You're not trying to avoid the topic. That's my favorite one, that second one, like really saying very explicitly, yes, I do want to talk about this. What's a better time? These sentence stems, don't forget, we'll share this slide deck with you. So if these seem useful to you, even if you want to like print them out or write them out and have them nearby, you'll be able to do that. But we also wanted to give you a tip to have a notepad and pen handy so that if you have multiple parents who are doing that, you can keep a list for yourself and maybe even a little bit about what they might be asking. Um, and um, you, sorry, when you keep that list, you can of course then be proactive in the follow-up, and you don't have to wait for them to do the additional reach out, which of course parents would appreciate. So we want to, another kind of general tip we want to give to you before we get into the particulars in a minute is the idea of avoiding reading aloud. So things like your tardier discipline processes, your grading policies, like the specifics of units, again, based on lots of feedback over years from parents and from colleagues, it's just kind of not that interesting. And this can be provided in a handout. Obviously, you can't hand things out physically, but you certainly could provide your parents with links this year. You could put them in the chat, and that would allow them to get that really basic information. Instead, what we're going to encourage you to do is to decide what information is really most important for parents that goes above and beyond just like the list of your policies. Maybe information about the course as a whole, things like the essential questions. What are like the big assignments of the year that you know that kids will either enjoy or maybe struggle with? Particular times of year that might be hard for kids. Those are the kinds of things that you might want to choose to focus on. Parents really want to know who you are and what you're like, so providing a picture into your personality and a little bit of your biography could be a really good idea. Like we said, probably not that interested in the minutia of different units. First, we're going to study this, and in October, we're going to study this, in November, like that kind of list, they generally aren't going to want to hear, but they want to know what their child's experience is going to be like in your classroom. And that's this year going to be particularly important to give them that sense. Under normal circumstances, a great thing to do is to greet them as they enter the room, but you can do that as they enter the Zoom, of course. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about using the waiting room and some choices that you have. So when it comes to deciding on a focus, you really probably should consider what the parent perspective is like in the middle of a pandemic, right? It's the elephant in the room. We don't want to avoid it. A couple of things that you can specifically address are necessary modifications. So when you envision what your class is going to look like, either in the day-to-day or in the broad planning of the year, what things do you know are going to need to be changed? So you might say things like, normally in person, we would do this. This year, we're going to be doing it this way. And embedded within that, reassurances are going to go a long way to really let parents know that even though you're making those modifications, you're confident that their kids will get the experiences that you intend them to have and to experience the learning that you want them to have. Another good thing that we think parents will have on their minds in terms of a pandemic perspective is just good ways to communicate, like letting them know really clearly how you want them to reach out to you, because they might not even realize that phone, for example, is an option, that they could leave you a message and that you'll get that forwarded in an email. So you might want to state those things explicitly. In addition, Sharon and I were brainstorming like, well, how could we find ways to prepare in advance for understanding the parent perspective? One idea that we came up with is you could give your kids a little homework assignment and ask them ahead of time to ask their parents what they want to know. So obviously this is coming up pretty quickly, but on Tuesday of next week in particular, you don't have to do it for all of your classes. You could do it Tuesday to Thursday and ask your Tuesday, that'll be a blue day, your blue day kids from Tuesday to Thursday to ask their parents, give me one question that you would want to know from my teacher. And then on Thursday, they could submit those maybe through a Google form. And then you go into the night knowing kind of generally what's on parents' minds. You could also take the parents out of the equation and maybe ask the kids themselves, right? That might be a faster way to get that information, is to just ask them, like, what have your parents been asking about? Like, what are they interested in to help you prepare? In addition, this is a little bit risky, but it could work. As parents enter, you could ask them to throw questions in the chat, like, what are you interested in? The reason why it's risky is that one, you never know what they might ask, but also the turnaround time could be really tricky. So you'd have to feel pretty comfortable that you could like adjust things on the fly if there are unanticipated patterns in the questions that they ask. So Sharon's now going to kind of tell you more information about how things work and some specific ideas for structures and content.
Great, thanks, Marshall. So this is what we know now about how it's going to work on Thursday, and I think information is coming soon from the district about this. It's working similarly at the two buildings, but we're going to be using our classroom Zoom links. So information will be coming to remind you how to make it so that other people other than authorized users can get into your Zoom classroom. And in addition to that, the administration is going to encourage students to participate with their parents, or at least be available for their parents, because there is some concern about the technology here. And for those families who maybe have never been in a Zoom, if the students are there, it will make it go much more smoothly on the parents' end. So I think the communication to parents is going to be to have their students available if possible. I do believe there's going to be a chance to get a student helper if you would like one, and we can talk in a little bit about a couple of places where that might be helpful to you in terms of running some of the Zoom technology if you make them a co-host. But for this one, it's students that are from different clubs and activities that you would sign up for and request the help. But you could also recruit somebody from your class if the students are going to be encouraged to come, and they do come, or if there's just a student you know who's volunteered to help you with technology, you could ask them if you think that would be useful. And then there was a question in the chat, which I didn't get to answer yet, but answering it now. There are going to be instructions about how to mute participants in your settings. There's a setting that you can set that will mute participants where they cannot unmute themselves. So you know how now everyone comes into our classrooms muted, but the student has full control to unmute and mute themselves. That can be turned off. So if you would like to not have questions from parents in that format, and we're going to talk about that more a little bit later in the presentation of some thinking behind why you would and why you wouldn't, there is a setting for that. I did also hear something that it's going to be set up in advance. I don't believe that's true. I believe you have to do the setting yourself. But we'll talk more about that. So just as Marshall mentioned, be prepared for tech problems as we go through now and get into a little more details. If you make decisions to what technology you're going to use, to just have that backup plan. And even for your Zoom link, depending on your comfort level and your internet and all of that and how it's been going for you in class, if it would make you more comfortable, think through, like, do I have a buddy who I could have my Zoom link through a partner or my IS? so that then they could get into my Zoom if for some reason I couldn't get into my Zoom. If that makes you more comfortable, then think through that level of plan too. And I should have mentioned on this slide, the Zoom links that are classroom links, they're going to be sent to the parents in one document. So most of us have given our ISs our class Zoom links, and if you haven't yet, they will be asking because they're going to merge them into a document that the parent receives with all of their students' class Zoom link. So you don't have to worry about giving them the link. All right. Marshall mentioned this. So when we were talking and thinking about this, there's quite a few decisions that you could make around the Zoom waiting room and how you want to use it. So by default, it's turned on for us. So one decision would be, are you going to let people drift in as they show up? Or are you going to wait until the quote unquote bell rings and it's time to start and then just say, let everybody in? This is a place where we were thinking a student helper might be useful. If you had someone, you could make them the co-host and they could be in charge of letting people in just so you're not focused on that admit button. I would expect parents are going to come in late just because they're going to have trouble and then they're going to get there late and you're in the middle. And if it's hard for you to hit that button and watch everything and watch the chat, just to think through what would make it more smooth and more comfortable for you, that's where a student helper could be really useful because they could just let people in for you. And one thing we weren't aware of, we know some people know, but maybe not everyone yet, you can make your Zoom waiting room have a few personal touches. So you can put a message in there. Right now it says like the host will let you in soon. That's the default. But just through the settings, you can add a message that says, welcome to Miss Sheehan's geometry class. Be there soon. Or where you put the message, you could put a little activity you want them to do. Jot down 3 ideas about blah, blah, blah while they're waiting. Like if you decide to have them sitting in the waiting room. Some people are playing music in their waiting room. You could do that. You could also, where you put the message, if you don't want an activity, but you could put a special quote to you or something related to your discipline. If you would like to do that, it might be a fun little touch that sets up the rest of your 10 minutes. But again, those things would be more of a possibility if you're going to have them wait. And just in terms of thinking through, if you're going to have them come in, then this is where an opener comes in. And these are the 4 areas we're going to throw ideas at you for. But what could an opener look like? What could an appeal look like? What could activities look like? How are you going to wrap this thing up? So particularly if you're having parents drop in, and they do this when they come into a classroom in the past when we've had these, and you chit chat with them and things, right? But so you could still do that in the Zoom, or you could have some other things happening. But one of the couple of main points about what would be helpful about an opener is just avoiding that quiet awkwardness. I mean, I feel like in Zoom, it's worse when everybody's just waiting. It's hard to make the small talk in the same way as it is in the classroom. Something to entertain them or give them a sense of your classroom or give them a sense of what it's like to be in your Zoom. If you already do something with your students in that awkward 5 minutes before class really starts, maybe that's what you would rely on, just to give them a sense of who you are and what their students are experiencing. Some other ideas that people have traditionally done in past years is have a little slideshow running. You could still do that. You could have pictures of something they've produced for you this year. You could have pictures that they turned in for you. Like, for instance, I had all my kids take a picture in the first couple of days of class of something in their home or something right outside in their neighborhood that was important to them. So some of them turned in a picture of a football. One kid turned in a picture of a plant in the front yard. And then they used that in class to introduce themselves to their classmates and then had something to talk about like why that was their picture. But I did end up making a collage out of them. So I don't think I'll do a slideshow, but I'll have the collage up there so parents can see the picture and maybe they look for their kid's picture. Marshall had another idea that he might use.
Yeah, in my humanities class, I did something similar where kids took photos of things in their homes or their neighborhoods that made them feel particularly human. That's kind of one of the essential questions of the course, is what makes us uniquely human. And I'm definitely going to use those as a slideshow with that question at the top of each slide as parents enter.
So one thing we just want to remind you about here, if you choose to do something like this, if you had names on the documents or the pictures or any identifying information, to make sure take those off before you put them up in front of the other parents. Another idea is if you're a person who has a lot of materials in your classroom that you usually had on display when parents come in, maybe you take pictures of some of those, and that's what's in your slideshow. The same way that they would have walked around the classroom or took a look at all the stuff on the walls, you could have pictures of that if you have them up. Another idea for an opener while people are waiting to get started is a quiz them on some facts they may have learned in school. Kind of the idea we were thinking is like when you're at a movie theater and you get to, you're there early and you're watching the movie trivia pop up in front of you. So the question pops up and then a couple seconds later the answer pops up. So something like that could be kind of fun, and it again gives a sense of your discipline and what's happening in your classroom. Another idea is cartoons or jokes. Here's a bunch of math ones. But if that fits, you could have a slideshow of cartoons. You could have a collage of them like this. Just something for them to kind of look at. Again, getting a sense of who you are and your choices in your curriculum. Then the next area we wanted to talk about was an appeal, because many of us do this in the traditional parent night where we want to get information from the parents. And here are all the ideas, and there are a couple other slides with ideas, and we'll talk about those. But before we even really get into it, the consideration would be, okay, so now how in this virtual environment are we going to get those little pieces of paper filled out, and can we? You know, and I'm certainly, a lot of our minds probably would go directly to a Google form, because that would be pretty simple to put together to get information. But the consideration would be, you know, it makes the meeting more complex. It makes more places for the technology not to work. And we're not sure that all of the parents have Zoom experience. So, you know, when we all first started in Zoom this summer, people have trouble sometimes getting the link out of the chat. Where do you put the link? Then they get out of the Zoom and then they don't know how to get back to the Zoom, and all of those kind of complexities. So just as you're considering this, think about, is it worth the complexity and the issues of equity that might appear just because of people's experience with the technology. Now, if you feel like your kids are mostly there or are going to be there, then it would work fine, because the students would help the parents no matter what with all the technology, and the kids are great at it. So, but if you decide to do it, some ideas are just the, you know, the general getting information from parents. It's a nice way to see who actually was there and who's not, because it's hard to keep track of that when you're doing your 10 minutes. Gives them a chance to tell you something that's on their mind. You know, what brings their child joy? What do they hope their child accomplishes? And then maybe one of the most important this year is just what's on parents' mind about e-learning for their student, and what's happening with it at home for them, and, you know, getting more information about that. But we just caution you to think through that background of how would you manage it during the 10 minutes? And maybe it's something that you say, please email me if you have any concerns, but you hit certain topics of things you would like to know. So now Marshall's going to talk about many activity ideas that you could use.
So a really useful approach in the classroom in particular is to try and get the parents to do an activity, a really short activity that would be similar to something you would have your students do. And that's still possible, we think, in the digital environment, but there are just some things we want you to think about. So we're going to give you some ideas for what the activities typically might be, and then some thoughts about how it might be a little bit different in the digital environment. So first of all, we'll just call these activities. You obviously have to think about materials, right? And so the picture on the left is like a posed, fully functional science lab, and there's a kid at home working on something science related. Obviously, you'd have to think about that, right? If you want the parents to do the activity. But again, like Sharon said, if the kids are there and they have access to the materials, they're sitting with their parents, then the parents would have the materials as well. We did actually hear from the science department that they are finding innovative ways to get materials to kids for labs. And so we know that this is actually from Jeff Rylander. He told us that our biology students have picked up a lab kit to perform some at-home experiments. And one of those was jumping beans, a lab around jumping beans and living organisms, studying living organisms. If that material is still available, that could be a great quick thing. That's an example of a really quick and easy thing that maybe parents could also engage in. And then you could transition into explaining like how that is typical of what you'll be doing in the digital environment. Here's another one. This is from an English classroom. Actually, I think the creator of this is here in our Zoom today. That's Phil Ralston. He uses this often, maybe even daily, with his kids to kind of get their juices flowing, get them thinking about language. We don't have time to go through all the answers, but they're meant to rhyme. The first one, footwear belonging to which person, whose shoes? And you could give parents, for example, a few minutes to try these. It'll be fun, but it's also for Phil, an example of something he actually does in class. Here's one that could be powerful in a social studies classroom. If it's a US class and you're studying civil rights, this is a very famous piece of photojournalism during desegregation of schools. It could be really powerful and interesting, but of course, like Sharon was alluding to earlier with thinking about issues of equity in terms of technology, we also want to be mindful of issues of equity in terms of an activity like this. And of course, this image is powerful in terms of history, but it's also an emotionally fraught time. And so if you chose something like this, you just want to be careful. Here's one that could work for maybe an English class or an art class. You could have kids going through an activity called a See, Think, Wonder activity where they're interpreting some art. That would be a great, if you do an activity like that in class, that's one that you could engage parents in for a few minutes. You could also do something with survey data, sharing either data that you've collected from students and then gathering similar data from the parents, asking them questions about content or opinions about content. As Sharon said earlier, though, don't forget that if you do share student data, you want it to be the macro data, right? You don't want to share an individual kid's answers or information. Another activity that you could engage parents in is sharing memories around their experiences with your subject matter during their school age years. And you can model this yourself. So like, for example, I might talk in my English classroom about some of my favorite and least favorite books from when I was in high school and ask parents if they're willing to share theirs. You could also review problem areas with parents. This makes me think about like in a math class. I know I have high schoolers, 2 high school age daughters in math class, and they learn math in just ways that I didn't when I was in high school in the 90s, right? And so if I were sitting in a math class, I'd be really interested to learn about the new ways to solve old problems. And I'm sure that's not exclusive to math, but you could also anticipate homework struggles that you know kids have. You could talk about the rhythms of the school year, and all of this you can bring together and kind of frame it as how you think parents can help, including plugging the TLC, especially if you teach freshmen. It's going to be important that those freshman parents hear about the TLC, and then you can copy and paste that link to the TLC Zoom into the chat, or you could email it to them later so that they know how to access that.
All right, just as we wrap up, there's a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to hit upon before wrapping up, and we'll be done within a couple minutes here. This issue of, we didn't mention yet really using the chat, and I think the chat could be really helpful during the session. I think a decision again has to be made. Marshall and I were talking about whether you want to turn it on or you want to turn it off. Because if you want questions from parents, that would be a good place to get them. There was the comment about, could you use it to have parents private message you about those answers to the question and the appeal that you're interested in? And I think that could work. The only worry would be is if they don't really know how to use it and they aren't careful and they send you some private information about their child and it goes to the whole group. So, because it's not that, I mean, you have to click on the button, but if they've not done it before, there might be a mistake made there. So that would just be something to consider. And then another question around using the breakout rooms, that could be a good way to go too. Again, it's like, the complexity of the technology is a consideration of whether you're going to get the benefit you want out of it. So I think all of these things could work, and everybody has to just make their own decision about what they're most comfortable with. And that's what Marshall and I are saying. We're happy to meet with you separately to talk through your own comfort level. But just as an ending, we don't want to end up rushing at the end like we're doing right now, or getting cut off by the bell. So just a couple ideas is maybe you assign some homework. I'll let you look at these prompts when you get it, if that's something, like just something to prompt this parents to have some way to have a conversation with their kid. I think I want to make sure we spend time on this one. Is I think a lot of us, I do anyway, typically use the any questions line, because that can fill 3 minutes, 2 minutes, depending on how much time you have at the end. But I think a concern with this question in this environment is, do you want all of the questions? Like when a lot of the adults in the building now who are interacting with parents interact with them, there are a lot of questions around, when is school opening? How come school's not opening? Where do you stand on school opening? And so if you're not comfortable with those kind of questions, you just might not want to open the door, or really think carefully about how can you frame your question to make it very narrow, and then have your one-liner made for, oh, well, that's something we're not talking about tonight. Do you have any questions about my course? Or, however you're going to get out of that, just thinking about it in advance so you're not caught off guard could be useful. And then again, that's the decision if the chat's open so they can ask you questions. Are they muted? Can they unmute or not? And what you're personally comfortable with. I know some people would be very uncomfortable that parents aren't asking them questions. So they might leave it all on and just be prepared. You could use any of those things from the openers could be used at the end. So just a nice thank you slide, a nice quote, another cartoon, those same ideas. So a nice image that, where you have a phrase about, we're all in this together, something to kind of wrap up your last few minutes. So we know we've gone a little bit over and people are rushing to get to class, but we really thank you for coming. We will stay here for a few minutes. So if you didn't get to ask the question you wanted to ask, please stay and ask it. You're welcome to email us, contact any of the 4 of us. We'd be more than happy to take a few minutes to help you think through things or find a couple things that you're trying to find that are just taking too much time. So thank you very much, and we'll see you guys all soon.